Hello everyone and welcome to this NERC funded Social Science Training for Natural Sciences workshop. I'm Dr Ian Mell
And I'm Dr. John Sturzaker.
and we'll be here on these podcasts and in person in Edinburgh on the 7th of March to talk you through how you might use social science methodologies and techniques in your work as a natural scientist. Both John and I are social scientists. We both work in geography and planning departments and we have extensive experience of working with a range of different methodologies across social sciences. The reason why we're putting together these screencasts is that there's a lot of very important information that provides a background and a context to the nature and the way in which social science is delivered, which we think is important for you to understand. But because of the amount of information that there is, it's easier to do it in a screencast for you, so you have some preparation before we actually meet in Edinburgh. There will be three screencasts. The first will be about the philosophy of social science. The second will be about how you might scope a social science project. And the final one will be about the ethical considerations you might not necessarily have been thinking about in a normal social science project. We'll try and keep the podcast relatively short so they're not too onerous to listen to. But if you could make sure that you listen to them before we start the sessions in Edinburgh, that would be fantastic. Now, over to John, who will start with the philosophy of social science.
Thank you. What I'm going to do here briefly is just for a few minutes talk through some of the kind of key philosophical underpinnings of social science, really, and talk about how they might differ from natural science. And as I'll go through, I'll use, sort of fairly black and white examples and say this is social science, this is natural science. But of course, these things are on a continuum, really, and the kind of extreme positions that might have characterized things once upon a time probably don't so much now, but they're useful as kind of as I say, extreme positions to set things against. So always good to start with a quote from a dead Greek philosopher. So this is from the first quote from Plato, obviously not in 1993, this is when it was translated. So he's talking about a battle of gods and giants going on between them over their quarrel about reality. And I guess that's kind of sets the frame for a lot of social science, really, particularly that using a constructivist framework that I'll explain more about in a minute. And the kind of essential point is that generally within social science, there's a commonly accepted understanding that there is no objective reality, and reality is about how we view it and how we construct it. But there are some things that are objectively true, like if I drop an apple, it's going to hit the ground. But many other aspects of life and how we go about our activities come down to how we perceive things and how we perceive each other. I'll explain more about that in a minute. So that's the kind of philosophical reason why this is important. But the second quote here from Moses and Knudsen from 2007, I think is equally important. So underneath any given research design and choice of methods lies a researcher's often implicit understanding of the nature of the world and how it should be studied. So the methods we use reflect what we're trying to do, how we think the world works, and I think this is equally true in social as it is in natural science. That we often use methods perhaps without really reflecting on why we're using them. We might think that at a kind of superficial level. We want to talk to a lot of people, so we'll do a questionnaire. But we don't necessarily think about the kind of underpinning philosophies behind some of those things. So I think that's an important point to remember for most researchers. Another quote here from Moses and Knudsen, which just distinguishes between two terms that are often used interchangeably. But here Moses and Knudsen specify that they are different and they mean different things. They talk about methods as tools and methodologies as toolboxes. So they then carry on with that analogy and conclude that we can expect electricians to view the world differently than carpenters. So they aim to resolve different types of problems. They might use the same tools. They might both use a screwdriver, for example, but they would use it in different ways. They would use it to do different things. So similarly, we might expect natural scientists to view the world differently from social scientists and hence have different toolboxes that might have some of the same tools in, but they might use in different ways and might use to solve different problems. What we want to do in the workshop in Edinburgh is to sort of understand the nature of these different toolboxes and try and help you as natural scientists understand the different tools that there are in a social sciences toolbox, if you like, and then understand a bit more about which you might want to use, which you definitely don't want to use, and maybe some that might be somewhere in the middle. So I talked right at the outset about using sort of extremes, if you like, in extreme positions, and this is a kind of the classic methodological divide between what's often called naturalism, which historically many natural scientists would have used, the understanding or the belief that there is an objective truth out there which is waiting to be discovered. So that scientists are looking for patterns which exist in nature, they exist whether or not you're looking at them, and your job as a scientist is to go out and find them, discover them, and understand them. The sort of extreme counterposition to that is constructivism, which says that there is no objective reality, and the patterns of activity in the world, the things that are going on, don't exist independently of how we view them. Us viewing them affects them. Scientists and society construct patterns of activity as we go on. So that was the classic view, that you had these two opposite poles, if you like, and never the twain shall meet. But really, it's more helpful to think about these things as being positions on a continuum, and most of us being somewhere along that continuum, perhaps not at the extreme of either end, perhaps somewhere in the middle. And the position that many social scientists tend to fall into is that they accept some of the principles of constructivism and some of the principles of naturalism, and they say there is a real world which exists independent of our experience. So that was the example of an apple falling or whatever, or the classic, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make any sound, kind of thing. So that's there. There is a real world, but it has many layers. It's very complicated to get at it and very difficult. And I think it's also important to remember that, particularly within social science, the very fact of trying to observe what's going on affects what happens. And we'll talk more about that on the day in terms of methods. But I guess a classic way of thinking about that would be how you phrase a question in an interview or a questionnaire will generate different answers. And even the person asking the question, they might ask it in different ways and put tone or emphasis on different words. So that will affect how people respond. So the same person can ask two different people the same question, and obviously get different responses. But the way they ask the question could be different, and people can understand things differently. So as I say, most social scientists probably consider themselves somewhere in the middle there, in that broad area of what's often called scientific or critical realism. So what are the implications of constructivism for social science? I've covered some of these already, or hinted at them, but just to sort of be clear. The first one is that purely objective research is all but impossible. Most social scientists would say that. That they are, as I say, the very act of carrying out the research, you bring your inherent biases with it in terms of how you choose your methods and how you put them into practice. So social scientists tend to be more likely, and I've emphasised the word likely here because it's not exclusively the case, to be happier to place themselves within the research. So it's getting more common, still not exclusive, but more common, that social science publications will say, I found this, or we found this, rather than the kind of classical science way of phrasing it, saying this was found. So they tend to be generally more happy to do that, though, as I say, that's not everybody. So the second point is that social scientists understand that people don't experience the world in the same way. Everywhere is different. Context is very important. So they can be reluctant to generalize too much from one or more case studies. And we'll talk much more about this on the day. This is often a critical issue for natural scientists trying to understand social science. That you do a study in one place, and when we write it up, we will say, well, if other places are similar to this, then you might be able to make these general, wider findings. But it's often very heavily caveated, because again, social scientists do emphasize and are aware that context is very important. And then the third point is that, and again, another quote from the Moses and Knudsen book. You'll get these references, by the way, and we can, in fact, maybe in the final podcast, we'll put them in so you can have a look at them. They're interested in understanding the meaning of a social action for the agent performing it, so for the person carrying it out. So social scientists tend, and again, this is a generalization, to be more interested in methods which help them explore why and how something is happening as much as what is happening. So it's trying to get sort of beneath the surface and understand what's going on, why something is happening, how it's being done. Final slide for this short podcast. Having heard all that for the last few minutes, why should you bother with social science? Why would it be of any interest to natural scientists to do social science? Well, a few things that we think make it important, that it can tell us about the real world, and obviously we're all under pressure to produce real world relevant research. But social science is about the real world. It's not about what's going on in the laboratory. It's about what's happening out there in real life.
And that's really important because increasingly there's a need to have a policy output or an impact on a community that you may be working with. So actually understanding how these different forms of discussions or research or activities work can be quite important. And in the current REF world and with the way that funding is being allocated, that transition of the science into a policy or into practice can be very, very important in terms of generating successful funding bids.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true. So where are we? Oh yeah. So second is that social science tends to be solution as much as problem centered. Now that's not always the case, but often it's about how do we solve a problem in society, whatever that might be, as much as understanding more about the problem. Some social science is more about problems, some is more about solutions. But I think there's particularly the positions that Ian and I come from, we're interested in, well, how do we solve problems? How do we move things forward?
And a large part of that is the next point, which is about it emphasises working with people. And this might be one of the more significant shifts, is that we're dealing with the way in which people interact, how behaviour changes, how people value and place their values on a location, on an activity, on an idea. And that can make social science quite complicated, quite broad, but it also allows you to work within a really, really nuanced set of approaches to find things that are really quite indicative of how certain people in certain locations work, and which can be quite an interesting area of study.
Absolutely. So the fourth point rather, social science recognises and seeks to gain from the fact that researchers are people too. So this is about what I mentioned earlier on, social scientists being happier to put themselves into the process, and by doing that, then they can sometimes understand, they can have more of a feel for how methods might be perceived by people. And so we might pilot questionnaires and interviews and that kind of stuff. And if you try out some of the questions you're asking on colleagues, and then you can very quickly say, okay, this isn't going to work. That's too broad a question, or too narrow, or whatever it might be the case.
And the next 3 points really add to what we've just said when they talk about the need to go beyond the pure science to maybe look at how the outcomes of a research project can be supported by the use of additional data gathering techniques from the social sciences, and how that can then be placed into your delivery of impact. I mean, and this is very, very important because, especially when we're talking to politicians or to decision makers, they do require the evidence based on scientific knowledge or the outcomes of a scientific inquiry, but they also want to know what the policy relevance is or what the impact might be on their constituents or the wider society. So that blending of the more experimental scientific method with the more social investigation can be quite an important way of actually showing a set of stakeholders that you actually understand both the data and what it means, but also its implications on society. And particularly with delivering impact, that we're looking at moving beyond just explaining something in terms of what the phenomena is, to then say, well, how is that going to change society? And particularly with the way that we're all working towards REF, I think that's a very important point to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So the final one on this slide is this great quote from Robson, that to just emphasize that you can do it. Anybody can do social science once they've obviously had some training to practice. As Robson says, the core skills are watching people and talking to them. Two things that we all do every day. Okay, so that's the end of this podcast. Thank you very much for watching.